They called her useless. They put her on a wooden crate, and they sold her for $2 like livestock. No one remembered her name. No one asked if she had somewhere to go, someone waiting. For 23 years, she had been a shadow in the Colson house, a ghost who cleaned and cooked and mended, only to be cast out the moment a younger, prettier face arrived. At 51, Ida Moley was deemed a leftover. She stood on that crate in the dusty auction yard, a black shawl her only possession, and held her chin like a woman with a bank account full of dignity. The men laughed. They muttered. $2, someone offered, more as a joke than a bid. And then a voice, quiet but firm, cut through the noise from the back. "I'll take her." The crowd turned. A man with dust in his beard and something gentle behind his silence stepped forward. He didn't haggle. He didn't jest. He met her gaze, handed $2 to the auctioneer, and then he looked at her, really looked at her, and didn't say, "You're mine." He said, "Let's go home." What happened next stunned everyone in the town, because the rancher, Jude Weller, didn't buy her to work. He bought her to rest. He put her on his wagon, and as the wheels creaked low and tired beneath them, he handed her a tin cup of water and a biscuit wrapped in oilcloth. He didn't ask her age. He didn't ask why they'd let her go. As dusk stretched across the horizon, he spoke. "I'm Jude Weller. Got a stretch of land northwest past the shale ridge. Empty house that ain't been kept right since Ma passed." Ida studied his face. The lines were carved from wind and silence, but there was a steadiness to him, like good soil. When the wagon hit a bump and her shawl slipped, he leaned over and gently tucked it back around her arms, like she was something precious. That night in his small cabin, he gave her the only bed. He rolled out a bedroll by the fire and told her she was safe. "You're not here to work," he said, his back to her. "Not unless you want to." For the first time in a long, long time, Ada didn't feel like a servant. She felt like a guest. But kindness, when it's unfamiliar, can feel more dangerous than cruelty. It makes you wait for the price. The days passed in a strange quiet. There was no bell to answer, no floors to scrub on her knees. She awoke with the sun because the light touched her face, not because she was ordered. She tried to earn her keep, cooking and cleaning until her knuckles were raw, but Jude never said a word. One afternoon, he walked into the kitchen where she was scrubbing an already clean pot and placed a single wild dandelion in a cracked glass jar on the windowsill. He looked at her, his eyes holding a deep sadness she didn't understand. "You don't have to earn your place here, Ada." Those words should have been a comfort. Instead, they felt like a warning. No one gives anything for free. She started to watch him. He was a man made of quiet work, mending fences, tending his few cattle. But at night, when he thought she was asleep, he was different. He would sit by the fire, not resting, but waiting. One night she peered through a crack in her door. He wasn't just sitting. He was cleaning a rifle, his movements sharp and practiced, and laid out beside him on the floor was a faded photograph. It wasn't of his mother. It was a picture of a younger man she'd never seen before, with a ghost of a smile and haunted eyes. Jude wasn't a simple rancher. He was a hunter. And Ida had a cold, sinking feeling that she wasn't his guest. She was the bait. The uneasy peace held for another week. Ida found herself listening to the silence, not the sound. She even laughed once, a rusty sound that burst out of her when a chicken stole a button from Jude's coat. He'd looked up and smiled, a real smile, and for a moment, the fear subsided. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was just a quiet man in a quiet house. Then came the knock on the door. It wasn't loud, just 3 steady raps that slid through Ida like a splinter. When Jude opened it, a man stood there in a gray suit, too fine for the dirt, too polished for the wind. His name was Mr. Beaksley, and his voice carried the cold bite of power. He wasn't from the Coulson family. This was a ghost from a different grave entirely. "I'm here for the property of Thomas Moley," Beaksley said, his eyes flicking past Jude to land on Ida. Specifically, his wife. Thomas, her late husband, a man dead 10 years, a quiet bookkeeper who'd supposedly died of a fever, leaving her with nothing but debts that had forced her into service. "She's not property." Jude's voice was low, a rumble of thunder from a distant mountain. Bexley gave a thin, cruel smile. "Isn't she? We have a different understanding. Thomas Moley didn't die of a fever, and he didn't leave you with nothing. He left you with a ledger. Our ledger. And we've come to collect." Ada's blood ran cold. A ledger. Thomas was a simple man. He kept books for ranchers, for the general store. What could he have possibly written down that would bring a man like this to their door? I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "Oh, I think you do," Beaksley sneered. "He was a thief, and you're a loose end." He took a step forward, but Jude moved to block him, a solid wall of quiet fury. "You'll leave now," Jude said. It wasn't a request. Beaksley laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "This isn't over, rancher. The Lam family always collects what they're owed. We'll be back, and next time we won't knock." He turned and walked away, the dust curling behind his fine boots. The silence he left behind was heavier than any sound. Ida sank onto a stool, her world tilting on its axis. The Lam family, the most powerful, most feared name in the territory, known for buying up land and crushing anyone who stood in their way. She turned to Jude, her mind a storm of questions. "I don't know anything about a ledger. I swear it." Jude watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he walked over to the hearth, his expression grim. "I think you do," he said. "You just don't know it yet." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. It was the auction receipt, the $2 receipt for her life. He didn't hand it to her. He slowly, deliberately unfolded it. On the back, written in her husband's faint, spidery handwriting, were a series of numbers and a single word: barn. The auction wasn't a sale. It was a message. The $2 price, the quiet rancher, the journey away from prying eyes. It was all a plan. Her husband, Thomas, hadn't died of a fever. He had been silenced, and before he had set in motion a desperate final gamble to get the truth out. He had hidden it, not with Ida, but for her. "He knew they were coming for him," Jude said, his voice low. "He arranged it all with a friend, a man who owed him a debt. The plan was to get you somewhere safe, somewhere they wouldn't look. The numbers are a combination." Together they walked out to the old, quiet barn. The air was thick with the smell of hay and old leather. Jude led her to a corner, to a section of the floor that looked no different from the rest. He pried up a loose board. Beneath it, nestled in the dark soil, was a small, heavy metal box, crusted with rust and time. Ida's hands trembled as she recited the numbers from the receipt. Jude worked the combination lock. It clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the years. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with Thomas's meticulous script. But it wasn't a record of cattle sales or grain prices. It was a detailed account of 2 decades of crime. Land grabs, extortion, hired guns, disappearances. It was the secret history of how the Lam family had built their empire, written by the man who had been forced to balance their bloody books. It was a death sentence for them all. Ada finally understood. Thomas hadn't abandoned her to poverty. He had been trying to protect her from this. His fever was a lie told by his murderers. She looked up at Jude, the last piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The rifle, the photograph, his watchfulness. "How did you know?" she whispered. Jude finally looked away from the ledger and met her eyes. His own were filled with a pain so deep it stole her breath. "The man in the photograph was my younger brother, Liam," he said, his voice thick with grief. "He worked for the Lames. He saw too much, just like your husband. He came to me, told me he was going to expose them. A week later, he vanished. They said he ran off. I knew they were lying. For 2 years, Jude had been hunting them. He'd followed whispers, rumors, piecing together a puzzle in the dark. He heard about the bookkeeper who died suddenly, and then, months later, he heard a strange rumor about the bookkeeper's widow being put up for auction for a coded price. He didn't know for sure, but he took the chance. He didn't buy a housemaid. He bought the key. He bought his only hope for justice. Their histories, their grief, were two sides of the same tarnished coin, minted by the same corrupt family. They weren't strangers. They were survivors. But as the terrible truth settled in the dusty air of the barn, a new sound drifted across the plains. It wasn't the wind. It was the steady, rhythmic beat of approaching horses. Not one rider. Many. Bexley was back, and he hadn't come to talk. They were trapped. The sound of hoofbeats grew into a thunderous drum roll. Beaksley and a half-dozen hired guns surrounded the small cabin, their forms dark silhouettes against the dying light. "Weller," Beaksley's voice cut through the air. "We know you have it. Give us the ledger and we'll let the woman live." It was a lie, and they all knew it. Jude bolted the door, his face a mask of grim resolve. He had one rifle and a box of cartridges. They had numbers and the certainty of their power. Peeking through a crack in the wall, Ida saw them dismount, their guns ready, their faces hard and cruel. Fear, cold and familiar, tried to grip her. For years she had survived by being invisible, by being quiet, by being useless. But looking at the ledger in her hands, the last testament of a husband she now knew was a brave man, something shifted inside her. She wasn't that person anymore. "They're arrogant," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The Lams. Their greed is their weakness." Jude looked at her, a question in his eyes. "They believe everyone has a price," she continued, an idea taking shape, desperate and wild. "They're not just here for the ledger. They're here because Thomas cheated them. They want everything he had." She grabbed a few blank pages from the back of an old account book and a pencil. Her hands, which had spent a lifetime scrubbing and serving, moved with a new purpose. She began to write, mimicking Thomas's neat script. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't a strategist. But she knew stories. And she began to write the one story a man like Beaksley would be unable to resist. A story of a hidden stash of gold, the Lamb's own skimmed profits that Thomas had secretly buried in the old abandoned Black Creek mine, a place known to be unstable and dangerous. A perfect trap. Jude watched her, and a slow understanding dawned on his face. He nodded once. As she finished writing, he went to the back of the cabin and worked silently on a loose board near the floor. He pointed. "When I give the signal, you run. Don't look back. Get to town. Find Sheriff Miller." He took the fake pages from her. Then he grabbed the real ledger and shoved it into her hands. "Go." Jude kicked open the front door and fired a single shot into the air, drawing their attention. "You want it? Here," he roared, and threw the folded fake pages into the dirt, halfway between the house and the riders. While their eyes were fixed on the prize, Ida slipped through the opening Jude had made at the back of the cabin. She ran, low to the ground, using the deepening twilight as cover, the heavy ledger clutched to her chest. Behind her, she heard Beaksley shouting, the rustle of paper, then a greedy, triumphant laugh. The bait was taken. Beaksley's men snatched up the pages. Their greed eclipsed their orders. The lure of stolen gold was stronger than the need to silence two nobodies. Leaving only 2 men behind to finish the job, Beaksley and the others mounted up and galloped off towards the old mine, their laughter echoing in the darkness. Ada didn't stop running. She could hear the two remaining gunmen approaching the cabin, could hear Jude's rifle crack once, then twice. Then silence. She choked back a sob and forced herself onward, her lungs burning, her only thought to get the real ledger to the law. Hours later, stumbling and exhausted, she saw the lights of the town. She burst into the sheriff's office, gasping for breath, and threw the ledger onto his desk. "The Lom family," she panted. "It's all in there. Murder. Everything. They tried to kill us." Sheriff Miller, a portly man with a shiny badge and shifty eyes, looked from her to the ledger. He picked it up, his expression unreadable. He opened it, read a page, and then looked back at her. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He looked annoyed. "Well, ma'am," he said, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. "Looks like you're under arrest for theft, and for the murder of those two poor fellas back at the Weller Ranch." He took the ledger, walked over to a heavy safe in the corner, and locked it inside. Then he took a key from his belt and locked her in a cold, dark cell. The truth hadn't set her free. It had just put her in a smaller cage. The iron door slammed shut, the sound of the key turning in the lock, a final metallic click of doom. Ida was alone in the dark, the hope that had carried her all those miles turning to ash in her mouth. The law wasn't the law. It was just another branch of the Lom family business. She had failed. Jude had sacrificed himself for nothing. But Jude Weller was not a man who left things to chance. He had taken out the two guards, but he hadn't ridden after Beaksley to fight. He'd followed at a distance, making sure the trap was sprung. He watched from a ridge as Beaksley and his men, arguing over the map Ida had drawn, entered the unstable mouth of the Black Creek mine. He waited until he heard the distant rumble of collapsing rock and timber. A grim, final justice. Then he rode for town, but not for the sheriff's office. He knew Miller was on the Lom payroll, just like half the officials in the territory. He rode instead to the one place the Lom's money couldn't reach, the small, windswept church on the edge of town. He found the old preacher, a man named Elias, whose sermons often hinted at the rot infesting their community. Jude had spoken with him weeks before, a seed of a plan planted just in case. Now it was time for the harvest. A few minutes later, the church bell began to toll. It wasn't the slow, steady ring for Sunday service. It was the frantic, urgent peal used only for fires or emergencies. Lights flickered on in houses. Doors opened. The townsfolk, ranchers, farmers, blacksmiths, people who had been squeezed, threatened, and cheated by the Lames for years, gathered in the square, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Jude Weller stood on the church steps, no longer a quiet stranger, but a man ablaze with purpose. He held up the faded photograph of his brother. "The Lom family took him from me," he yelled, his voice ringing with a grief and fury that commanded their attention. "Just like they've taken from all of you. They took your water rights, your grazing lands, and they did it with threats and with murder." He told them everything. He told them about the bookkeeper, Thomas Moley, who was murdered for what he knew. And he told them about the bookkeeper's widow, a brave woman named Ida, who was at this very moment locked in the sheriff's jail for daring to bring the truth to light. "The proof is in a ledger locked in the sheriff's safe," he roared. "They've ruled us with fear for too long. Tonight, that fear ends." A murmur went through the crowd. It was one thing to suffer in silence, but another to hear your own secret bitterness spoken aloud, to see it reflected in the eyes of your neighbors. The farmer who had lost his pasture, the shopkeeper forced to pay protection money. They looked at each other, and the shared fear began to burn away, replaced by a slow-burning anger. The crowd, no longer just a group of individuals, but a single body with a single will, turned and marched toward the sheriff's office. Miller, seeing the sea of torchlight and determined faces, threw down his keys and fled. They unlocked Ada's cell. They opened the safe, and in the flickering torchlight, as Jude read passages from the ledger aloud, the full, ugly story of the Lam family's reign of terror was laid bare for all to see. The corruption, the violence, the greed. It was all there in Thomas Mowley's careful, damning script. The Lam Empire, built on shadows and whispers, couldn't survive the light. With their enforcers buried in the mine and their crimes exposed to the world, their power crumbled to dust overnight. A few weeks later, Ida stood on the porch of the ranch house. The fences were mended, the bullet holes patched. The air was clean and quiet. Jude came and stood behind her, his arms wrapping gently around her waist. He held out a piece of paper. It was the deed to the ranch. He had been to the land office. At the bottom, next to his signature, was a blank line. He handed her a pen. "It's your home, too," he said softly, "if you want it." She took the pen, and in a steady hand, she wrote her name. Ida Mowley. Not the name of a housemaid, or a widow, or a $2 leftover. The name of a woman who had walked through the fire and found her way home. He turned her to face him. His stormy eyes were clear now, filled with a peace she never thought she'd see. "You're no stranger, Ida," he said. "You were just the part of my story I hadn't met yet." They hadn't saved each other. They had stood together and found the strength to save themselves. In the quiet of the setting sun, two broken people on a dusty road had, against all odds, built a future out of courage and hope. This story is a powerful reminder that even when the world calls you useless, your true worth might be a secret waiting to be unlocked. And sometimes the family you choose is the one that helps you fight your greatest battles. If you believe everyone deserves a second chance, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you want more stories about the fight for justice on the untamed frontier, make sure you subscribe. You never know what secrets are just waiting to be uncovered.